Welcome to the At Sea Podcast. I'm your host, Justin McRoberts. Sara Billups is a Seattle-based writer who has been speaking at and about the communal practice of religion for a number of years now. Most recently, she's collected a number of those thoughts in a book called Orphaned Believers. It's a wonderful book, actually deeply insightful. And I was thrilled to have her on the podcast to talk not only about that book, but about the history she's had with religion, with Christianity specifically, and the things that led to the assembly of those thoughts that make up that book. I enjoyed the conversation. I think you will as well. Check it out. Thanks for making some space and some time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's so nice to connect. I've loved connecting online, and it's really fun to chat with you. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And you're talking to me from you're still in the Pacific Northwest. You're Western still?
Yep, in Seattle.
You're in Seattle. Are you from Seattle?
I'm from Indiana, so I grew up in the Midwest, but my husband and I moved out 18 years ago, so it's been a long time.
Where in Indiana?
I grew up in Fort Wayne, Northeast.
Mm-hmm.
And then I met Drew at Taylor, and then we lived in Muncie for a few years after. So
I've been to Taylor. I've been to Taylor a couple of times. I've been to Taylor, and then I'm going to forget the name of the Indiana Wesleyan.
Mm-hmm.
Been out there a couple of times.
Did you speak at Taylor? Did you like a Taylor chapel?
I did Taylor Chapel a couple of times, and then I was there on someone else's tour, and then I think I was there once just on my own playing music at some point.
Very cool. Okay. Yeah. I've graduated in 2000. It's been a minute, but I was.
What'd you study?
Creative writing.
So this has been like the path forever. Did you think of that? Like, were you thinking writing, creativity, artistry, like you were 6 and you're like, I have a novel in me? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's been writing's kind of like been my jam. And so since I was little, since I was a kid. And so like my husband studied music composition, and he now is a coffee professional and works in ministry. So I feel very proud to have had the family title of undergraduate that actually is using my degree in some way now in my life. It's uncommon with us creative folk.
It is. Well, oftentimes, I mean, the folks who actually do the study part of it in college tend to continue on with it. It's just more so that like, it's almost like, well, this isn't always the case, but like folks are like, yeah, I'm studying engineering. That's not what you want to do. And so they get bored to death with engineering. They're like, finally, like, I'm going to do the record or whatever.
The music. So. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, totally.
Does Seattle feel like home, or do you feel kind of torn between home? Like, what is home for you?
No, home is definitely here.
Okay.
We went through a discernment a couple years ago before the pandemic, I suppose, about whether or not we should go back to the Midwest, but had pretty clear confirmation that this is our place. And
how did you determine that?
Something wild would have to happen. Well, the idea of, I write about this a bit in the book, but a lot of the really lovely monastic traditions, contemplative traditions, Ignatian stuff, I was, taught to be skeptical of as a kid, because growing up, we thought maybe Catholics weren't really Christians, or we didn't pray to Mary. So there was a lot of just kind of stay away from smells and bells. But I'm in my mid-40s now. And
smells and bells. Gracious.
And certainly have found a lot of comfort in those practices. And so the idea of two things, of one, like a Quaker, this is obviously Quaker tradition, but a clearness committee. So worked with my spiritual director at church and some other friends to do a series of sessions where we discerned the central question: should we leave or stay? Which was uncomfortable to do in community. And I think we normally make a decision and then tell everybody, like, hey, I'm moving. Yes. But it was really cool to be able to, and a little bit awkward at times and almost embarrassing, really, to say, like, we're not sure, but we're going to process together. But something really sweet came in doing that with other people. So there were a group of, I think, 4 or 5 other folks that we knew but didn't know super well.
Having done one, for a lot of listeners who won't have any idea what a committee actually does in that context, talk about a clearness committee, like what, like, and maybe if you're comfortable walking through like maybe the particulars, like how that actually go, what do you submit, how does the process go? Because it is as a discernment process, because it's not, and this is part of what I want you to help folks out with it. It's not quite just like a decision-making tool. It's more than that. So, but as an instrument of like clarity, it's really unique. There's nothing quite like it. So talk about your process in a clearness community. What'd you do? What happened?
Yeah, that's right. So I in grad school did a class on contemplative stuff and on spiritual discernment. And so we actually did a clearness committee in class, this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, which was interesting to do with folks I really didn't know well. But then I read, Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer, where he talks about a specific practice of discerning if he should become a university president, and a very interesting breakthrough. And so essentially and I've led some of the groups since with friends from church or other folks, so I really enjoy them. And the idea is not to get to an answer at the end, but to get to a place of kind of healthy indifference or clarity, like an arrow towards where you should go. So instead of, the group would meet, we'd start with prayer and silence. And then instead of asking directed questions, the questions are very open-ended. And so it may be, Sarah, when you think about going to Indiana, how does your body feel? Like, do you feel yourself rise towards that idea or kind of recoil back? So there's sort of more physicality to some of the questions. Ideally, the spirit leads them. So it was a really beautiful experience. And ideally at the end, we were trying to get to a healthy indifference, this idea of Jesuit indifference, where our hands were open to staying or going, and we were totally giving that to God. So the idea now of looking back, feeling, confirmed, staying, was only again clarified and reinforced at that time. So I think that they're incredibly valuable, and that more folks in the church should explore that possibility for discernment.
It's such a different, I mean, even for folks, not even, but like a first time into a process like that, it really does disappoint one's expectations emotionally, right? That at some point you're going to come to like, someone just freaking tell me what to do. Like I have all these really loving, kind, wise people around me. Will someone just say, listen, here's your clarity. Like you want that, but it can help unpack and like peel away. Like, this is actually what I'm feeling. Like, I really am feeling that. So that whatever decision I make, I can actually make with a degree of, I want to say confidence, with a little bit more like, I can take a sure step or a more sure step, even in an unsure direction. There's nothing quite like it. I'm a huge fan. I'm really glad you did that. That's awesome.
Yeah, but it was really cool, and I've loved doing them with other people. But you're right, it is frustrating and it's quiet. But I think that often when the Holy Spirit speaks, it is in silence and kind of in an upside down way. And so, I think Parker Palmer, in that book, someone asked him, what would you like most about being a university president? And he did have an aha moment, like, oh, I would just like being able to say I'm a university president, And so sometimes there's very clarifying moments, but for the most part, it's more just a time to kind of really sit and think that is so much more visceral than like a pro-con list. And a little countercultural, because how often do we get to discern things together and not just announce I'm moving? So
if I'm getting this right, a part of the impetus for your work, a part of the drive behind your public work, with specifically the book we're going to talk about, but even I'm blanking on the name of it's called the Bitter Scroll, as a matter of fact, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I think I'm picking this up, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong. You provide language for folks, maybe like in crisis, like folks who are experiencing tension with the culture they belong to, specifically if they're like in a mainline evangelical religious space. Is how accurate is that in terms of like what you're doing with writing, specifically with the book and with the Bitter Scroll?
Yeah. Bitter Scroll is just my monthly Substack, and with Orphaned Believers, I mean, as a mildly literary person, a person that's aspirationally literary.
Literary. That's great.
I should make a shirt. I really like language that's a little bit more imaginative. So for example, when I moved to Seattle, I mean, it's a whole story, but for about 12 years, I had an incredibly dry time spiritually. And so I talk about wandering in a spiritual desert, because that language really resonates. And so when I say orphaned believers, I really just mean a Christian in America who's looking around the church and having trouble finding Jesus. Like any of us looking around and not knowing where Jesus is in the church. And so I mean that like in two ways. One, culturally, I mean, in Seattle and in many progressive cities, it's exhausting when I meet someone and we talk about faith stuff and I explain I'm a Christian, but not that kind, or here's what I mean. It's just a lot to kind of go through. So there's kind of that cultural piece. Or in the Bible Belt, like when I lived in Indiana, there was it was expected to go to church. There was a lot of cultural Christianity, but it was harder for me to see a lot of formation, or I didn't feel like I was really finding Jesus in that space for me. And then also, like, you know, spiritually, folks who feel like they've been hung out to dry because they've been in a congregation with a broken pastor or have experienced abuse, like people wondering if politics always has to be embedded with our faith. A lot of those kind of questions kind of surface too. So that's a little bit what I mean when I use that term.
Yeah, I love that. Tidbit of a question here is when you talk about your experience being in Seattle, telling someone you're a person of faith, telling someone you're a Christian, and then having to have that follow-up conversation as a lifelong West Coaster, I'll, like, even maybe especially, I don't know, even and maybe especially now, I'll be in places like Texas or North Florida, North Carolina. I'll be somewhere in the South, and it'll come up that I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and the assumption is that must be really difficult for me as a Christian. Like, wow, how are you pulling that off? And that's an interesting conversation to have. Talk about your experience there, where you are in a town, and someone asks, you know, it comes up and you're Christian, and you talk, like, the assumptions they come up with, and like, well, not that kind. Like, how has that conversation actually gone for you in particular? Like, how does that actually play out for you where you live?
I mean, this is what's interesting about that conversation. So I think I'd say first, I did a kind of Wednesday night Bible study with a church in Florida, and the church self-identified as 90% conservative voters or Trump supporters. I wasn't sure how that would go, because certainly culturally in Seattle, that's less common. But it was a really, really good conversation with lovely people. And their central curiosity is, we feel like the West Coast is ahead of us of the curve with people leaving the church. We feel like you're 5 years ahead. What is that like? And so interestingly, my answer is, it's in some ways very refreshing, because if you identify as a Christian here, it's not accidentally. If you show up at church, it is, unless your parents are dragging you, you probably want to be there. And the thing that I love about the church is that my husband and I have gone to a healthy congregation here for 18 years. We've been quite lucky, and that's been an uncommon experience with a lot of peers. But I love that I don't get to curate or pick who I go to church with. This isn't like brunch. It's just so beautiful to be with people you might not choose but end up loving. So I might talk a little bit about that to folks that I meet here. But interestingly, I was talking to someone about this yesterday. When I talk to someone here that doesn't identify as a Christian about my faith, I had a lot of fear about that before I started writing publicly in 2018.
Why?
Because I think, well, you know, I landed in Seattle in 2004. I started working I wrote for alt weeklies. I was editing various websites and writing about food. I was working for small presses. I was doing really fun, kind of cool work, but I did not talk about my Christianity for a long time. And in fact, went to church on Sunday, but it was not a wholehearted faith. It was certainly something that I kind of kept quiet, because when we landed here, I sensed a real animosity, specifically around evangelicalism. I didn't understand that, Justin, until much more recently. When we landed here from Seattle, we came to do co-housing, intentional community with some friends. This was like in the Shane Claiborne new monastic era, like riding the missional church wave. Tim Keller at Redeemers talking about folks going back to the city. So we were really optimistic, as you can be if you're a young white middle-class person, to go to the city and start a community or a church. And
until you've been hurt or run over or hit the wall.
That's right. So but then very quickly we landed and realized this doesn't feel, quote unquote, feel like we thought it would. And just like how in this Cultural Moment podcast, Mark Sayers and John Mark Comer talk about cultural assimilation, very quickly the city began to assimilate us. And a lot of friends that we moved with and other people in our life that were Christians began to use the term spiritual but not religious. That was kind of a common term back in that time. And so I think that a combination of my husband and I feeling like everyone else is kind of progressing or moving on or using different language and we're just kind of staying the same, matched with my own kind of work and professional life, made me very quiet for a long time about my faith. And so I think that fast forwarding to the time when I began to write publicly, I thought, what would like Phil from the publishing house do if he knew that I was a Christian? And so it was very clearly like a self-aggrandized. I mean, Phil's not gonna go home and tell his spouse, oh, I can't believe I worked with someone that's a Christian, and then wake up the next morning over coffee and say, I still can't believe it. Like Phil actually doesn't really care, and interestingly is incredibly gracious, it turns out. So
was that helpful? So that time you were quiet, a helpful season for you? You're paying attention, like. Was it like
it was not, it was based in fear. It was not helpful. I think I lost a lot of time creatively because it's kind of like if my light was under a bushel, it was like almost snuffed out. And there was this feeling of, I mean, again, Enneagram 4, whatever, of almost like carrying a bag of rocks. It became almost, it was a physical weight. Like I can't keep going on maintaining two identities. And then I realized, oh, nobody actually is difficult or is going to ghost me. And interestingly, the folks that have been the most gracious and curious about my writing or the book have almost always been folks that don't believe the same thing that I do about God in any way. There's just a real curiosity and graciousness I've encountered. And sadly, I can't say the same about our very politicized and broken church in a lot of ways.
True.
So that's kind of where I landed.
That's good. And in that context, the thing you said a minute ago about church can be a place you said I don't get to decide who I'm with, but potentially, hopefully you end up loving them. I was just having a conversation with someone else about like the beauty for them telling these stories about being on some sort of team through the church where like it's her and some person 20 years older and then like some junior high school kids and like a 4-year-old and like this is the team and you're with all these being with and being in life, however you want to say it, doing life with and in community with people who aren't like you that's a high value. Do you have boundaries there? Are there places where like, here's a line? So there's how do I want to frame this question? I would, my experience with in me and around me is like there's a line somewhere. Where it's like, yes, we can live in difference and live as different people, but then with this topic, with this issue, I can't anymore. So for some folks, that's the line is LGBTQ plus membership or even belonging. For some folks, it's you talk about doing a Bible study for Trump supporters. For some folks, it's that if you have a red hat, I'm not going to be around you.
That's right. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about your experience personally, but also maybe prescriptively. Like, where is that line between like it can be good and helpful and fruitful and even enjoyable to be in relationship with folks who aren't like you, but then like then at some point are you supporting bad behaviors or supporting terrible systems?
Is there kind of like a tacit consent almost by association?
Either that tacit consent or like you're doing damage to yourself. That if you put yourself so for friends of mine who are queer, one of the things you'll see every Sunday is through Twitter is you don't have to go to church where you're not wanted. Where like if you're church with folks who have a difference of opinion in this world, like that damages your soul. I think that's a worthy challenge. I don't have an answer. So I'd love to hear you talk about like what's been your experience doing church with people, being in community with people with whom you have difference. Where are the boundaries? Where are the lines? Like, how's that go?
That's such a good question. I mean, I can talk from my experience and I'm just, as you're talking and asking this, I'm thinking about the pandemic and I'm specifically honing in on vaccines, on masks, kind of like the latest issue du jour. And, the thing that's interesting about, so I go to an Anglican church in Capitol Hill in Seattle, same congregation for 18 years. And the thing that the talking point that I always had, and I don't mean that as a platitude, the way that I actually experienced the congregation was, oh, we're a group of people that are broken, moving towards Jesus, and there are folks on various sides of the aisle politically and socially, but we come together on Sunday, and it's actually this really beautiful tension that we hold because we're pursuing Jesus across difference. But the truth is, I mean, the truth is there's been a what I call a pressing or a clarification. I think that I mention the church I go to because I think this has played out in a lot of other places and a lot of other cities across the US and even beyond. There's just we've lost people, a lot of people for a lot of reasons. In practical, they've left because they've moved or it's expensive here or whatever, but also because they can't square going to church with people that don't think or believe the same way that they do. And there's a real impoverishment of the culture of who we are. So those of us that are left are thinking, and again, the church has never been, when Mars Hill collapsed, it was maybe 250. We probably gained about 100 people, but we've been about 150 people the whole way through. It's a fairly small church, but it's like, how do we define this space where we want to be able to be a space that makes welcome when there's real complication and we keep kind of shedding people? And I don't have a good or clear answer. I don't have good or clear guidelines. I have grief and a sense of sadness and a longing to be an example of a place that can be different. But I don't have an answer because it's just it feels so fresh. And even with the mask thing or the vaccine thing, I mean, some churches in Seattle had like a mask section. This wasn't where I go, but like people can sit in these pews, you know, and that just felt ridiculous and difficult for us to think through. So
it was definitely a weird. It was definitely weird is not the word I want to use. Weird is the word I use when I don't know what to say. It was definitely a tricky cultural conversation to navigate because it even by nature, and this is part of what I mean is even by nature of hosting a conversation about it, like masks and vaccines. In some spaces, even by nature of holding a conversation about it, you have offended someone who feels so strongly. This is not because for some folks, it's not a conversation. Similarly with LGBTQ membership or LGBTQ faith, like it's not even a conversation. And if you're willing to have the conversation, you've already crossed the line. And that's true for queer folks and for like staunchly not queer folks. That's like what a difficult bit of leadership navigation to have to do.
That's right. And we haven't even mentioned, I mean, after George Floyd was murdered and, you know, there were some instances of folks we encountered that that thought that racism didn't exist. But for the most part, that is certainly in Seattle. I mean, we have our own bubble, but that is certainly not our situation, but it was for a lot of churches. But really, folks, like, are we talking about social justice, I say that in quotes, like too much from the pulpit or not enough? I mean, it is really, it is exhausting. So I say that as a member of the vestry and part of the leadership at church. It's just, it's quite exhausting.
One of the things you actually wrote, and I'm looking at some of the bits from your book, you said, you know, the church remains our best hope. You're talking about like a pathway forward, specifically with regards to belonging and connection with God. The church remains our best hope. She's what Christ left us with. The church, the body of Christ, is always being reformed and renewed, which I think is a key bit of this cultural moment. Orphan believers can reform the church because it is the people with consciences that cry out who create change. So can you springboard from that and talk to a couple groups of people that pay attention to this podcast? One group are pastors, like church leader types, not even folks who like hold the title pastor, but they're folks who lead house churches, or they wouldn't call it house churches. They just have people who show up in their living rooms on Tuesday nights or Wednesday nights or whatever, or actual like institutional pastors. Talk to pastors about that hope, because we'll do that first and then a second, 1 second. For a lot of folks, as some, like, I coach pastors, it's not just exhausting, it's deflating and depressing. Like this moment in which so many folks have left, that's already hard, but the reasons why they've left if you're someone who likes to hold space for people,
Yeah.
and folks are just bouncing and they have a legitimate critique, they're also the people who have the energy to make change in the area, and they're leaving and they're gone.
That's right.
Talk to those folks about that hope. Like, what does a pastor hope for? What does a pastor do now in this moment where you have all these orphan believers? Average church attendance has fallen something like 35% in the last like 6 to 8 months. What is a pastor to do as people are bouncing around these very important issues for them?
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind is to pull back the curtain and talk about what that experience is like. I think that
You mean
it's not
personally?
personally, yeah, it's
Mm.
not, I mean, it's not just about folks leaving the church. There's many folks aren't comfortable using the term Christian, like evangelical. We're not talking about that, like just the
Yeah.
idea of the term Christian, which has been, I think, in a lot of ways co-opted by Christian nationalists,
Yeah.
is a complication. So I feel like now it's hard to agree on common language, which I think comes from a lot of pain and from good thought. And so I think reclaiming that word or talking about definitions is helpful. And also the fact that in some parts of the states, the evangelical church is growing, but it's growing because of this kind of political and social club of folks that are now embracing the term Christian nationalism. As
Mm.
you know, a lot of us have seen, there's a new popular book by a pastor talking about why that term is something we should embrace. And so I think that when I'm writing about these topics publicly, there are always questions like, what's the difference between, I thought that patriotism was a good thing. And then it's like, well, actually, patriotism is a good thing. Like, we are called to love our country, but nationalism is conflating patriotism with it's conflating God and country. And so then
Yeah.
there's a lot of confusion still. So I think people are leaving. There are orphaned believers because they've been hurt and because there is not a common language anymore or vocabulary. And there's a lot of misunderstanding. And so I think being clear and pulling the curtain back can be one way to start. I mean, what I didn't mention is my husband had worked in coffee for 22 years and has went to Fuller and thought he'd never work in the church, and has just started to work as an assistant pastor part-time and consult with coffee part-time. And so I
That's
had
such a
this
great
like
story.
image.
I'm never working the church. I'd start on Tuesday, actually. Yes.
and, so, and so I had this image of him like on a highway, like moving, like the truck kind of moving towards the scene of disaster when everyone else is like leaving. Like,
Yeah.
some of us are built with this stuff that can, I don't know if it's a personality type or what kind of fortification we have to have, but some people can do that work and can thrive in it. Other people, like Enneagram 4s like me, it is very draining, or I talk about it poetically or I write about it, but I'm not in the work like he is. And so I just think there's some of us that are gifted with those skills from God, and because we just happen to be people that can do it.
See, that's good, and that's part of why I liked, in this section, it's encapsulated in the phrase, but you come back to this theme pretty often throughout the course of the book. I'm not even sure it's necessarily like the point of the book per se, but like you come back to this often, that the church is always being reformed and renewed, and that insofar as this is a moment, like this can be. I come really, I don't like to say the word should almost ever. I'm a father of children. I try not to say the word should. Should be. I come like damn close to saying this should be a moment of refining and renewing.
That's right.
And I'll caveat this with this. Seth Godin was in a conversation recently. He's a big voice in my life, in which he noted that boomers have been responsible for media and communication for 40 plus years, and that because boomers center themselves as often as they do, because boomers are now in their 70s and their lives are ending, like the media tension around every issue is doomsday because their lives are ending. That this doesn't have to be a moment with regards to church in which, like, and this is the way you hear it like I do, people are freaking out like it's the end of Christianity in America, it's the end of the church as we know it, all these things. Boy, it really doesn't have to be that. Like, I don't want to say like you're being dramatic, but like it doesn't have to be that way. And there are folks, and these are some of the folks I'm trying to talk to and care for. There are some folks who, as the thing is falling apart around them, they're going to stay, and they'll wait till the dust settles if they have to, and they'll just pick up whatever around them and build something new. They're going to be there.
Yeah,
Those
that's right.
leaders, talk to folks who might never have identified as leaders. They've been shaped by their culture as consumers. You're a person who comes and consumes this thing, and now this thing no longer works. Talk to those folks who've left. Like, what kind of responsibility should someone take for like the culture, for the institution? Is this a call? Like, do you come back because this is home? Like, what do you say, like, as someone who wants to lead folks? What do you say to folks who've like left? I don't want to be around it. It's a big freaking mess. Let's just let it die, let it burn. Like, what does Sara Billups say to someone in that camp?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to someone in that camp with a lot of tenderness and a lot of empathy, and I hope spaciousness. I mean, I think that if we're blessed with the gift of long life, I think things take a little while. I mean, here's the thing. So I came up in an evangelical home. My dad was obsessed with end times. I had a lot of fear that I wasn't really saved. This is a very common story. And so I'd lay in bed every night and ask Jesus to come into my heart. And I did this hundreds or thousands of times because I wanted to be sure. And so I think that, and I don't say this as a theological comment, I do think that if we decide to follow Jesus, to identify as Christians, there's either a conversion process or moment or whatever. For some people, it's subtle. For some, it's quite drastic. My dad had a very drastic conversion in the 70s. But I mean this more culturally. I think that I was given this feeling like I had to make sure I was okay, that I was really in the book of life. And I think the truth is that we can carry each other, that through that 12 years of spiritual desert I wandered through in Seattle, I think that Drew, my husband, really carried me. I've carried him. And I think that in health, the church can carry us too. And so, the church is, we serve a triune God, right? Like, God is communal. He's made us to be communal. And so when I say church, I really just mean the gathered body of believers.
Yes.
Whatever that expression looks like. And you mentioned that some people that listen to the podcast, maybe they have like a house church or whatever they want to call it on Tuesday or Wednesday nights. So whatever that season looks like, I'm so non-anxious about it. If people need to take a break, then take a break. Like, if you're doubting, I think that I was taught to fear doubt, or doubt was going to help me like turn over a rock and uncover everything that I knew was wrong. Like, if God is real, for example, I believe in a literal virgin birth and resurrection, right? Like, if it's not a myth, if those are true things, and I need to believe that can change me, that can hold up. And so I would say, don't be afraid to doubt. Ask big questions. Take the time that you need, but don't isolate. Like, move towards community in some way, in a way that makes sense right now. Because I think that then the moment when we isolate is when it can become a very difficult hill to climb.
Is it an overstatement to say that even as an orphan, I have, this is almost certainly going to be an overstatement, so feel free to correct the hell out of this. Do you feel like even as an orphan, I have a responsibility to family? Like being an orphan or identifying, there's the phrase, identifying as an orphan, does not abdicate I don't abdicate my responsibility to other people just because I feel isolated. I get to, and this is part of we get, like, I don't have to give in to the isolation. I can feel like I need a break, but just that by sheer nature of being alive and having breath, I share space with other people. Even as an orphan, don't I still bear some form of responsibility to the people around me with whom I share even history?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we all affect each other, right? We all, the way that we talk about faith, the way that we are sarcastic or cynical or hopeful or lead with love. I mean, I think that we're both Gen X, right? Like, I've maybe got a toe in the millennial world, but like I'm in a subculture of people that are taught to be skeptical and question. So how I talk about God and the language I use impacts other people. So yeah, of course, like, we all are leading all the time. We're all affecting each other all the time. That's just part of being a human in the world. But the other thought I had is, before the pandemic, I'm really interested in the history of revival and have done some research into revival. I write a bit about the Toronto Blessing in the book that happened in the 90s. But I think for a long time, I was praying, like, God, bring revival, like, in my life, I want to see, like, I want an Anna or Simeon moment. Like, I want to see you move. Like, I want
Yeah.
to see things change. And that has shifted
Hmm.
profoundly for me. I no longer, I no longer, but kind of like going back to what we talked about in the beginning, this idea of Jesuit indifference. Like, even if we don't get to see it, like, even if we live our whole
Yeah.
lives praying for and trying to model and work for the health of the church, there's
Yeah.
no guarantee. In fact, things will probably get worse before they get better, right? Like denominations will probably continue to splinter. Politics and culture wars aren't going to stop. But those of us that have hearts burning for change, that believe in reform, that really believe, again, if it's not a myth, that Christ will preserve the church,
Yeah.
that is beautiful and true. And so that is enough. Like that's enough.
And it should
So
up, and in other words, it should provide. One would hope. I shouldn't say should. One would hope that that kind of faith provides me with a peace instead of working from. And you and I both seen this, the anxiousness that
that's
comes
right.
from, and on in a lot of corners, not just the anxiousness that comes like in the seat of leadership that looks around at your congregation. Some, this has come up with the podcast a few times. A friend of mine is a church leader in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and on the other side of, it's one of the most churched counties in the country. Like everyone goes. It's like a tiny little Texas. Everyone goes to church. And uh after things opened back up post pandemic, 70% of the folks who initially ceased to go to their congregations on Sundays, 70% of those folks didn't return.
Mm.
Like given the option, like given some time off, they're like, oh, we're not going to go. It's 18 months later, 2 years for some people, they didn't go back.
Mm.
And the anxiousness among leaders at the time of like, what the hell just happened and what do we do about it?
Yeah.
In the same way, perhaps, like, as if you have been hurt, legitimately hurt, and if you do have one of those cultural differences that like you really just can't stand by and watch people propagate this, if that's true of you and you need some time away, take that. And similarly, for leaders, like, feel scared. That's okay. Like
Yeah.
that's highly appropriate. But for goodness sake, don't build anything from that emotional posture. Don't go planning for the future out of a place of like, oh crap, we need to fix it. Because
That's right.
that's a recipe. One, it's a recipe for like shortening your life. And two, everyone can smell that. Like everyone can smell like you trying to save your thing. Give yourself space and time. Feel orphaned. That's one of the weird like flip sides to like all these folks who have left in congregationally.
Yeah.
Boy, like the pastor, the people we're talking about, the pastor who cares, the person who runs into the cultural building on fire, those folks feel really freaking alone too. Like really, really alone.
That's such a good point. That's right. There's such a frenetic energy. Yeah, that's right.
Give yourself time to feel scared, disappointed, hurt, and find that thing you just said. Like, what did you said? I feel so non-anxious about
Non-anxious.
this. Like,
That's right.
get to that point before you start planning and building and scheming again.
Yeah, let's circle back to the clearness committee too. That could be a good time to invite friends to kind of discern what's next. But yeah, and I think the elephant in the room, of course, is that pastors have a financial. I mean, there's certainly it's your job. It's a calling, but it's also a way that you're supporting your family. Like there are reasonable considerations as to why there's a lot of anxiousness around church attendance. Like there are practical reasons and spiritual reasons. It all makes sense.
Yeah.
So again, a lot of tenderness to folks in that space, but again, it's not our job to lead the church. It's our job to be faithful and to let God do what God will do in this time.
It's great,
even if it's a time of oppressing or clarifying.
So I came to you by nature of Instagram. I know a little bit about the Bitter Scroll. I know the book. I want to turn a little bit of a corner here and talk about your process as a creator, as a maker of cultural artifacts, whether that's email lists or books. Talk about yourself as an author. You said like you grew up with this sort of inkling. The cheap way to ask this question is like, talk about the assembling of this book. Did you have like reflections floating around? Did you sit down and say, like, I'm going to finally write this thing? How did the thing come together for someone? And this is a lot of folks, for someone who's looking to like assemble their thoughts
Yeah.
about their own experience of a cultural moment. Like, what did it look like for you? Did you pick up pieces that were laying around? Did you decide in a moment, like, I'm going to write from scratch? How did it go?
Yeah, as a as a person that is not a public speaker first, or I mean, I'm a writer first, and so for me, it wasn't a question of I have this other medium I want to turn into a book, and so for some folks it is, and that's a different path. But I can speak for my kind of path as a person that loves writing. I thought I would never be able to write a book. I thought writing a book was for other people for my entire life, from going to the Barnes and Noble in high school on Friday nights, getting a coffee, like a, I don't know, a peppermint latte, and like walking around thinking, what is this magical world of publishing? So I've been interested forever. I had a literary magazine and a small press, and just poked around. I'm doing my doctorate of ministry at the Peterson Center up in Michigan with Wayne Collier and at Western. And so it's the cohort's called the Sacred Art of Writing. And so I'm working with other writers, thinking about how are they on their path to publication, and realize like there's a difference between being a writer and an author. And that's something that I didn't see at first. And so
talk more about that, because I'm with you 100%.
Yep,
There's the difference between being a writer and an author. What's that difference for you?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been a writer since I was a kid, but the idea of being an author requires two things. One, let's say you have a book contract. It means that you have to spend time researching and producing a well-crafted and well-edited piece of material. But then there's a second phase where you put on your marketer's hat, so like when a book is being put into the world, book launch season is a real thing. It has real requirements.
Yep.
There's a whole social media piece. There's a public piece that some of us don't think about when we think about writing a book. We don't think about what it means to bring it into the world, to steward it well and publicly. And so there's a lot of anxiety, I think, with first-time authors like me. Like, I have to sell enough books to do it again. Like, what if I don't like hit the mark? What if I can't keep going? But I've really calmed down about that, because I realized if you're a writer, you're a writer first. And if you're an author, that means you publish something, and that's beautiful and a gift. But I'm a writer after, no matter what happens. That's something I carry with me. So I've learned,
in a sense, like the author part is like in the same way that if you're someone who cares for people, you want to do so spiritually, socially, you can take a job as a pastor and do that for however long it lasts. And then if and when that goes away, you're still that person who cares for people spiritually, socially. That's sort of the relationship you're pointing out. Like an author, like it's a title that has to do with a particular job you do, but the work of your life stays the same as a writer.
That's right. Absolutely. That's like the calling or identity piece. And so I've learned a whole lot about the publishing world. And I would also say that as a woman in the Christian publishing world, I've learned, Kate Bowler talks about this in The Preacher's Wife, how there are ways that women who are not preaching have found to still be in that position of power. Maybe it's a musician or an artist. There's the preacher's wife. There's the person that speaks at conferences to stadium-sized crowds, but is not considered a pastor, right? And so the interesting piece of being a woman in Christian publishing has been a whole other dynamic, especially because the work that I'm doing is certainly not gender specific and is more journalistic. So that's been another interesting dynamic. So I've learned a lot, Justin. It's been quite a process. It's been really good, but interesting.
Give me an example of something or realize or like more about yourself now after putting work in the world, because that's part of what changes, right? Is you take the stuff that's in you that you damn well better believe for reals to put in a book, because that's not going away. Now it's in stone. You've put it in the world, and it kind of comes back to you in different ways, and you sort of see yourself differently. It's one of the things that makes it, and you and I, that's part of what we're talking about. It's part of the thing that makes it scary for folks to put work in the world, is because you actually see yourself differently on the other side of it. So talk about like, what do you know about yourself? What have you learned about yourself? What do you like more about yourself now on the other side of being a published author and putting this specific work in the world?
Yeah, I mean, of course, when you're asking that, I'm thinking about all of sides of myself I didn't know I had that came out in the process. So
Like
there's
what?
a lot. Well, there's a lot that I guess what happens is typically folks have an idea for a book, and that came out one morning. The idea came pretty quickly. I got out index cards. My husband came downstairs. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I have this idea." So it came really quickly. I had a wild weekend of writing the introduction and some other pieces that just kind of flew out. And then you go into writing a book proposal, typically if you're a first-time author, nonfiction. Mm-hmm. And so that process was excruciating and slow because you have to typically write out chapter summaries and have a real frame and structure. So any kind of creative flow it's a different kind of thing. You have comps and a marketing plan. It's a business plan, right? And so then that piece was difficult. But then, I started working with an agent, John Blaze, who is at the Bindery, who is completely great and really the best. And we started pitching the book. And that's when I started seeing sides of myself come out that I didn't know that I had, because the anxiety, like the hopes, the sort of highs and lows of rejection. So I'm used to pitching op-eds and articles. I'm used to, you usually don't hear from an editor, or if you do, it's really good news, but you're still rejected. So I've had plenty of practice with pitching. But when it's something that feels so much like you, like quote unquote feels, and again, for it feels like a part of your person, it's hard to separate out who you are from the work. And so I think that that was an interesting process that made me realize I have a lot of anxiety attached to this work. This matters because it's so personal. That was a time of me kind of beginning to separate the work from my own identity and to honor it in a healthy way, but to have some boundaries. So then when the writing process happened and it finally came out in the world, I think that the thing that I've learned that I consider a gift and a grace is that I had this idea in 3 years ago, and I believe in it more than ever. Like I think that I've gotten close to a sense of calling and a real desire in me to continue to work on behalf of the health of the church and to in my own kind of pastoral way to be able to model faithfulness. Like if anybody needs an example of like a middle-aged white lady in Seattle that's being faithful, like in a complicated culture, like hey, I'm here and I'm doing that through this work. And so cultivating community around that, connecting with people has been generative and awesome. So that has been really lovely.
That's great. I love that answer. Thank you. And thanks for your time today. I really appreciated this.
This has been so fun. Thank you so much.
You're super welcome. And thank you for joining me on this episode of the At Sea Podcast. If you'd like to follow up with Sara Billups, you can visit her at sarabillups.com. That's Sarah without the H, Billups with 2 L's, SaraBillups.com. From there, you can sign up for the Bitter Scroll, which we referenced during the conversation. Also jump to any place where you prefer to buy books to pick up Orphaned Believers. And if you'd like to be one of the folks that helps make this podcast happen, we'd love to have you on the team. Visit me at patreon.com/Justin McRoberts. Until next time.